Welcome to Spooky TV, where every story sends chills down your spine and mysteries keep you guessing. I'm Jack, your guide through the darkest corners of the supernatural. So for more terrifying tales and mind-bending mysteries, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you stay updated on all our eerie adventures. Ready to face the unknown? Let's dive in, if you dare.
It was the summer of '95, and the open road was calling our names. Mike, Emma, and I had just graduated from college, and we were ready to celebrate our newfound freedom. We packed up Mike's old van, affectionately named the Beast, and set off on a road trip across the country. Our destination was the Grand Canyon, but we had no intention of taking the boring route. We were going to drive down Highway 66, the infamous Mother Road, and soak up all the quirky charm and adventure it had to offer. Little did we know our journey would take us down a dark path, one that would test our friendship and our sanity. As we cruised down the highway, the sun beating down on our faces, we felt alive. We sang along to the radio, took turns telling stories, and marveled at the strange attractions that dotted the roadside. There was the world's largest ball of twine, a museum dedicated to the history of barbed wire, and even a giant statue of a blue whale that seemed to appear out of nowhere. We laughed and joked, feeling like we were on top of the world. But as the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The rolling hills and lush forests gave way to a desolate, barren expanse of nothingness. The sky turned a sickly shade of yellow, and the air grew thick with an eerie, unsettling energy. We exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. After all, we were on an adventure. What could possibly go wrong? As the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves at a rundown diner, the only sign of life for miles around. The neon sign creaked in the wind, reading Eddie's Eats in flickering letters. We hesitated for a moment, but our growling stomachs and the promise of coffee drew us in. Inside the diner was a time capsule from the 1950s, complete with vinyl booths and a jukebox playing tunes from a bygone era. The waitress, a friendly woman named Darla, took our order and warned us about the devil's stretch ahead.
Don't drive it at night.
She said, her voice low and serious. Strange things happen on that road. We laughed it off as small-town superstition, but as we left the diner and hit the road, we couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. The darkness seemed to press in around us, and the silence was oppressive. Suddenly, Mike slammed on the brakes, and we skidded to a stop.
What's wrong?
Emma asked, her voice trembling. Look, Mike said, pointing to the side of the road, and that's when we saw him. A tall, lanky figure with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. He was standing by the side of the road, thumb raised in a hitchhiking gesture. We exchanged uneasy glances, but something about him seemed off.
Don't pick him up.
Emma whispered, but Mike was already rolling down the window.
Hey man, where you headed?
He asked. The hitchhiker leaned in, his voice low and raspy.
Just down the road,
He said.
I'm headed to
He paused, his eyes glinting in the dark.
the next town.
We hesitated, but something about his words sent a shiver down our spines.
Okay, hop in.
Mike said finally, and that's when things started to go very, very wrong. As the hitchhiker settled into the back seat, we couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that surrounded him. No, it wasn't just silence. It was as if the very air around him was thick and heavy, like a fog that clung to our skin. Emma tried to make small talk, but he just grunted in response, his eyes fixed on some point outside the window. Mike and I exchanged nervous glances, but we were too far in to turn back now. We drove on, the darkness outside seeming to press in around us like a physical force. And then, without warning, the hitchhiker spoke up.
Take the next exit.
He rasped, his voice like a rusty gate.
I'll show you something interesting.
We took the exit, and the hitchhiker directed us down a series of increasingly narrow and winding roads. The GPS lost signal, and we found ourselves deep in the heart of nowhere. The trees seemed to close in around us, casting long, ominous shadows on the ground. Emma was getting more and more agitated, her voice trembling as she asked where we were going. The hitchhiker just chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound.
Ha ha ha. You'll see.
He repeated, and then, suddenly, we emerged into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, ruined church, its windows like empty eyes staring back at us. The hitchhiker cackled with glee.
Welcome to my home,
He said.
You'll be staying here forever.
As we stepped out of the van, the hitchhiker's demeanor changed. He seemed to relax, his shoulders slumping in a way that made him seem almost human. But there was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. Emma, still shaken, clung to Mike's arm as the hitchhiker led us towards the church.
This way.
He said, his voice low and gravelly. As we approached the entrance, I noticed something strange. The door was covered in scratches, deep gashes that seemed to spell out a message.
What's this?
I asked, my heart racing. The hitchhiker just smiled.
A warning.
He said,
From the last ones who came here.
As we stepped inside, I realized that we were not alone. There were others, huddled in the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. The hitchhiker began to speak, his voice weaving a strange, hypnotic spell. Emma and Mike seemed entranced, their eyes fixed on him with an unnerving fascination, and I realized with a jolt of terror that we were trapped. Suddenly I started feeling dizzy, and darkness came before my eyes as I fell to the ground. As I regained consciousness, I found myself in a cramped, dimly lit room. The hitchhiker was nowhere to be seen, but Emma and Mike were huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. I tried to speak, but my voice was hoarse and barely audible. Suddenly the door creaked open, and a figure loomed in the entrance. It was a woman, her face gaunt and haunted, her eyes sunken with a deep sadness. She moved towards us, her movements slow and deliberate.
You're the ones who picked up the hitchhiker.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper.
I've been searching for him. He's been causing trouble in these parts for weeks.
She glanced around the room as if searching for something.
You need to get out of here. Now.
I realized with a jolt of fear that we were caught in the middle of something sinister. The woman's words were laced with a sense of urgency, and I knew we had to trust her. But as we followed her out of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something even more dangerous. As we followed the woman through the winding corridors, I couldn't help but notice the eerie atmosphere. The walls were adorned with old photographs, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow us as we moved. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. We finally emerged into a dimly lit parking lot where a rusted old van waited. The woman gestured for us to get in. As we drove away from the building, I asked her who she was and what was going on. She hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror before answering.
My name is Sarah. I've been tracking the hitchhiker for weeks. He's not what he seems.
She paused, her eyes clouding over.
He's been leaving a trail of bodies across the country, and I think he's just getting started.
I felt a chill run down my spine as I exchanged a terrified glance with Emma and Mike. We were in grave danger, and I knew we had to get as far away from the hitchhiker as possible. But as we drove deeper into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded towards some unknown fate. As we drove, Sarah told us more about the hitchhiker's victims. They were all young travelers, picked up on deserted roads and never seen again. The police were stumped, unable to find any connections between the cases. But Sarah was convinced that the hitchhiker was the key. Suddenly, the van's headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road. It was the hitchhiker, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Sarah slammed on the brakes, and we skidded to a stop just a few feet away from him.
"He's found us,"
she said, her voice trembling. The hitchhiker began to walk towards us, his movements slow and deliberate. Sarah grabbed a small bag from under the seat and handed it to me.
"Get out and run,"
she said.
"Don't look back."
I hesitated, but Emma and Mike were already opening the doors. We spilled out onto the pavement, the hitchhiker's eyes fixed on us like a predator. Sarah screamed.
"Go!"
And we sprinted into the darkness, the bag clutched in my hand. We ran for what felt like hours, our feet pounding against the deserted road. The bag bounced against my leg, its contents clanking with each step. I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. Emma and Mike were ahead of me, their breathless gasps echoing through the night air. Just when I thought we'd left the hitchhiker behind, I heard the sound of footsteps closing in. Sarah's words echoed in my mind.
"Don't look back."
But I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart froze. The hitchhiker was gaining on us, his eyes blazing with an unnatural hunger. I saw something in his hand, a glint of metal that made my blood run cold. I faced forward, pumping my arms as I ran. We were nearing a turn in the road, a dark shape looming ahead.
"Get into the woods,"
Emma screamed, darting off the road. We followed, crashing through the underbrush as the hitchhikers were echoed behind us. We ran through the woods, branches snapping beneath our feet. The darkness seemed to swallow us whole, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I stumbled, my ankle twisting beneath me. Emma grabbed my arm, pulling me up as we kept moving. Mike was ahead, his voice calling out as he pushed through the underbrush.
"There's a cabin up ahead. We can hide there."
We burst through the trees, seeing the outline of a small structure in the distance. We reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. I leaned against it, panting as Emma frantically searched for a lock. Mike was already moving, grabbing a chair to barricade the door. As we caught our breath, I realized the bag was still clutched in my hand. I opened it, revealing a collection of strange items, a vial of liquid, a pocket knife, and a small book bound in black leather. Sarah's voice echoed in my mind. You'll need these to survive. But what did they mean? And how could they help us against the hitchhiker? As we barricaded the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trapped. The cabin was small, with no windows and only one door. If the hitchhiker found us, we'd be sitting ducks. Emma noticed my concern and said,
We need to call for help.
but when she pulled out her phone, there was no signal. We were completely cut off from the outside world. Mike, ever the pragmatist, began to search the cabin for anything useful. He found a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. As he fiddled with the dials, a voice crackled through the static.
Survivors of the Route 66 massacre. Hitchhiker still at large. Avoid the area at all costs.
The message repeated, fading into static. We exchanged a terrified glance. We were the survivors. And the hitchhiker was still out there. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound the creaking of the old cabin. We huddled together in the darkness, our breathing the only sound. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any noise from outside, but there was nothing, just an oppressive silence. Suddenly, Emma said,
What was that?
I listened again, and this time I heard it too. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. Mike moved cautiously towards the door, his hands outstretched like a blind man.
It's coming from outside.
He said. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to claw its way in. I remembered the pocket knife in the bag and handed it to Mike. He took it, his eyes locked on the door. As the scratching reached a fever pitch, Mike said,
Get back.
We retreated to the far corner of the cabin, our hearts racing. And then the scratching stopped. The silence was even more terrifying. The silence was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. We waited, frozen, as the seconds ticked by. Then a low creaking sound echoed through the cabin. The door was slowly opening. Mike stood tall, the pocket knife at the ready. Emma and I huddled together, our eyes fixed on the door. As the door creaked open, a sliver of moonlight illuminated the cabin, and then a figure loomed in the entrance. It was the hitchhiker, his eyes black as coal, his skin gray and decaying. He grinned, revealing crooked teeth as he stepped inside. Mike charged forward, the pocket knife flashing in the moonlight. But the hitchhiker was too strong, too fast. He swatted Mike aside like a fly, sending him crashing to the floor. As Emma and I cowered in the corner, the hitchhiker began to move towards us, his eyes fixed on us with an unspeakable hunger, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cabin floor, my head throbbing with pain. Emma was beside me, her eyes wide with fear. Mike was nowhere to be seen. The hitchhiker stood over us, his grin twisted and cruel.
You should have kept driving,
He said, his voice dripping with malice. As he raised his foot to deliver the final blow, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. The hitchhiker's head snapped up, his eyes flicking towards the door. Sarah, the mysterious woman from the van, stood in the entrance, a shotgun smoking in her hands.
Get out, while you still can.
The hitchhiker snarled, but he backed away, disappearing into the darkness. As we stumbled out of the cabin, Sarah's eyes scanned the surrounding woods, her shotgun at the ready. What is that thing? I asked her, still trying to process what had just happened. Sarah's expression turned grim.
The hitchhiker is an ancient entity, a spirit of the road. It feeds on the fear and terror of those who travel. It can't be killed, only temporarily repelled.
I stared at her in disbelief. But you shot it. Sarah nodded.
I did, but the hitchhiker has the power to manipulate its form. It can heal from wounds that would be fatal to a human, and it will keep coming until it claims its next victim.
Emma spoke up, her voice shaking.
Why is it after us?
Sarah's eyes locked onto hers.
Because you three were chosen. You were meant to be its next meal. But I've been tracking it for months, trying to stop it, and I won't let it claim you without a fight.
As we stood there, frozen in fear, the woods around us seemed to grow darker, as if the hitchhiker was closing in. And then a faint whisper seemed to carry on the wind. I'll be back.
The hitchhiker, it's an ancient entity, born from the darkness of the open road,
She said.
It feeds on fear, growing stronger with each victim.
Emma shuddered.
How can we stop it?
Sarah's expression turned grim.
I've been tracking it for months, trying to find its weakness, but it's cunning, always staying one step ahead.
I thought back to the cabin, the hitchhiker's twisted grin. What about the shotgun? Why didn't that kill it? Sarah hesitated.
I've been wondering that myself. I think it's because the hitchhiker has a host of sorts, a human body it can inhabit. The shotgun might have killed the host, but the entity itself survived.
Mike spoke up, his voice laced with skepticism.
You mean it's like a parasite?
Sarah nodded.
Exactly. And until we find a way to kill the entity itself, it'll just keep coming back.
As we drove on, the darkness outside seemed to grow thicker, like a living presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the hitchhiker was waiting for its next chance to strike.
Thanks for tuning in to Spooky TV. If you enjoyed the chills and thrills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss out on our latest scares. Until next time, stay spooky.